The first influence on Tatang was as a young boy before he took the trip on a bangka to Cebu, which finally landed him in Zamboanga and then Stucolo. Okay. After that, he came under the tutelage of the ancestor of a common friend and was an adoptive son of a major personage in the kingdom, but not the Sultan. Okay. The next influence on Tatang would be his trip back home, where he was reviewed in his own culture because he had turned Muslim in many ways and was now getting back to the pagan Christian culture that he had left. This was a time when he reviewed all of the histories of his race and of his culture, about the Aswang and all of the denizens of the other world. And then his father met up with an old friend who came to Bantayan and recruited Tatang essentially back to Zamboanga. This was Pedro Cortes, with whom Tatang spent many years, acting as Cortes's assistant in Cortes's adventures in trying to capture criminals or their heads, because they were more convenient to bring to the police station. Okay. And
what I'm hearing is there was already a very refined system of movement and combat. But what about a structure of actually passing it on to a new generation? Well, basically, I guess my point is, like, we see entirely different pedagogies with, like, Yuli Romo, he developed his own thing. Edgar had his own pedagogy. Ricketts before probably had his own pedagogy, but I understand now it's pretty much aligned with
Tony
pedagogy. Hmong Henry had an entirely different way of doing it, and then it's like, from what I understand is, Hmong Norman had developed something entirely different also in Canada.
yes. Okay, let's.
And, you know, you have the way you're trying to pass on information to your students.
Okay, let's start with Norman. When Norman was recruited to go to Canada, we offered to teach him the basic system that Tony and I had discovered in Tatang. But he refused and said, no, I have my own way of doing it. So he started calling the movements by the number of the cut. So the combate general became 1, 2, 3, and so on and so forth. Since Norman was a respected friend, we did not want to offend him. Then we kept our distance. Okay. Now, Norman was a schoolmate in college. He graduated accounting, and I went through several courses: accounting, engineering, pre-med. Okay. And we met again at Tatang's place. Turned out that he was Tatang's nephew. Yes. No, he was a relative of Tatang. I think a direct blood relative. Because Tatang also traced his lineage to Panay.
And
Pedro Reyes was a cousin on my mother's side, an Ilocano. We were engaged in the same trade. We were management consultants. He for San Miguel Corporation, myself for banks. But I never saw him play. Okay? And he was very good on a theoretical basis about principles of movement, principles of combat. But this is to be expected because he was a management man. Okay. And he had a very scholarly approach. And because he was older than most of us, we respected him, considered him our elder. Roberto Morales was doing his thesis and had taken a sabbatical and usually hung out at the Makati YMCA where he met Belzer, who came to the Philippines looking for any kind of arnis. So they developed a friendship. Morales brought Belzer to Tatang, and then Belzer asked to be accompanied to the south by Tatang and Morales. So they went to the south, all the way to Holo. And I actually was part of a reconstructive Zoom meeting with Belzer. Roberto Morales was looking into using or developing it for physical education. Okay. Unfortunately, things went bad for him. He couldn't finish his thesis, continued his sabbatical until he died of a stroke. Henry Espera started out with us, but only on his days off from driving a jeep. And sometimes that day off did not happen on a Sunday. So, and he is still a very shy person and played in another part of the park where we did. Henry Espera, because he operated in seclusion, especially when Tony was no longer frequently around and when I had the opportunity to just go and visit Tatang at his place instead of having to hang out at Luneta. Eventually, when Henry retired from driving, he was able to spend more time with Tatang. Henry's movements of Ilustrisimo at the beginning were almost perfectly like those of Tatang in terms of movement, principle, philosophy, and intention. But the crazy aspect of civilized pedagogy came in, and his students wanted to classify his movements according to certain statutes of physical arts pedagogy, physical education pedagogy. At a certain point, after Tatang died, Tony called me to a secluded portion of the park and asked to talk with me. I said, yeah, of course, what? And he said, I want to tell you that even if my movements are no longer the same as those of Tatangs, the principles still follow the principles of Tatang that we studied. Okay. And I said, yes, I agree. So this went on for a while, and Tony was more intent on evolving applications of the mother techniques, meaning to say the minutiae of mother techniques. If your angle changed a bit, then this is how you would take the cut, etc., etc. Still trying to replicate Tatang's approach. In the meantime, I kept to the mother techniques. Now, about 4 years before Tony died, he asked me, can you come more frequently to Luneta so that our play will be the same? I said, let's keep it the way it is now. I keep to the original, the few, and you develop the applications. That way, we will have a reference point, and your students will become more dynamic. Okay. So, to settle, it was a politic way of saying that I no longer agreed with the changes that were being introduced. But this has a lot to do with the character of the Filipino. Okay. In the Philippines, if we are playing, let's say, with sticks, and you hit me a bit too hard, or you hit me at all, I take it as an insult. And I'll carry it by hitting you harder. And then it becomes a fight. So Tony modified the feeding approach to where the cut or the strike will not present any danger or threat to the student. Okay? And at a measure that really will make the student accept that, no way, you don't mean any harm to me.
For your students, is there anything else that we're not doing yet that you really want us to start taking on where we can still get your feedback?
It is still the question of being able to establish measure with proper footwork. I posted on the group the action that Arnold and I had in Davao. And in this, I show the whole set of being able to move fast forward and backward or sidewards, always with the left hand out. It's as if I am actually holding a sword with my left hand. I am exposing my unarmed hand to the sword because I'm trying to catch that sword hand. And my sword is only, in case I'm able to grab, then I use it to hit. With Tata, it was always a split second behind. His sword was always a split second behind his left hand, which was used to stop, to grab, to parry, to move aside, okay, the sword hand of the opponent. And always, in many of the videos archived by Tuffer, it was always strong on strong, strong on strong. Why? Number one, because we have shorter swords than the Europeans. Why shorter? Because we need to fight at closer quarter.
So really, the footwork of Doble, Carera, and Darag is missing.
Yes. Yes.
Anything else for you that you see missing in the sparring of your students?
You have got to smother your opponent with blows. Okay, you must not give your opponent a chance to recover. To be able to recover. You are always on him.
Always stuffing him.
Stifling him.
Yes. Recently, I think it was Okano. He wrote in this journal, Southeast Asian Martial Arts, and he talked about two-beat follow-up.
Yes, because Tatang was very concerned about the number of beats required to strike your opponent. He said, if it's more than 2 beats to bring down your opponent, it is not mine. Kung labis ng 2 bilang, hindi ko iskrima yan. Because a lot of movements, when you scrutinize them, because of the desire for power to chop down from helm to stem, people cut down and then use a lot of effort to raise the sword and then cut down again. With Tatang, if he had cut down, then he will simply thrust forward. And when he had thrust forward, then he would cut down again. So all movements do work. There is no superfluous movement. There is no movement, actually, that does not do productive work. And by productive, it means it's either to cut down the opponent or to stifle the opponent so that he cannot fight back.
It's my experience that with Tatang, with Henry and Norman at the time, and with you, there's no preset follow-ups.
Yes, because you need to see what angle that man is holding his sword at so that you know where to hit. If you have a preset follow-up, you might be cutting at empty spaces. You might be striking at empty spaces. So, it is always a full awareness of what is happening. It is not an automatic, repetitive, habituated movement.
Let's imagine 75 years from now. What advice would you give to these people who are training in a vacuum?
In a specious and possibly insulting way, I would say, get into a real fight. Because only the emotional requirements of survival will bring out whatever technique you may have learned. If you are fighting for show, the flavor is lost. If you're fighting for a tournament, you might, if the price were high enough. There is a bet that needs to be wagered, and that bet is your life, or has to be almost as valuable as your life, which is honor.
Thank you. How authentic can a system still be once it's handed down to a first-generation student, a second-generation student? What's lost between the first and second generation?
There is a professional way of transmitting physical information where you have video studies, where you have measurements of angle and direction and speed by a special kind of device that I see being used today, using the camera. And there is also the study of the actual efficiencies that are necessary in order to be a split second ahead of your opponent. Once these are studied and accepted, number one, and then understood by the student, the chances that 90% of the information will be retained. But the mental approach is very critical. The student will need to want to replicate for preservation purposes. the student must be exposed to a situation where the wager is high enough. That is why there is a tendency for all of these supposed combat sports to turn into sports and no longer into combat dynamics. When you teach the military and put them in situations where they know their life will be in danger, then their training and their absorption is faster and more accurate than when you are simply drilling them in an open field. So it is always the cost. What will it cost me if I cannot do it properly?
Going back to the question, because you see the answer is like there can be a high level of authenticity when the context is fully recreated,
Yes,
meaning a scenario where there is a high cost,
yes,
and when there is a scientific study of the motions and practices actually being involved.
yes,
So when those two things happen, you can actually recreate it, and actually you added a third element. It requires a student who aspires
yes.
to recreating those techniques. So
Yes.
three things.
Ang speed namin sa sa simulan natin sa lastiko. Lastiko, medyo mahaba, long range. Long range. Ang distansya niyan, aabutin ng itak, yung kamay ng kalaban. Yan ang lastikohan. Action na, ha? Okay. Dila, explikasyon na ito. Oh. Ngayon, pagkatataga, makikita, kung talagang mag-aaway, itaga mo, hindi mo siya abutin. Kaya kailangan umi-step ka. Pag step mo, ang gagawin lang niya, i-atras lang niya ang konti ang katawan niya. Oo, tama-tama ng distansya. Ngayon,
At what point should one modify and evolve the archive system / curriculum?
The evolution must follow rules of efficiency. And somehow, the present system for the weight of sword, because obviously if you use a foil, it's a different game. But for the weight of sword used, which is about the weight of a shinai, then the most efficient movements have already been established. It is now your perception and your ability to execute the technique a split second ahead of your opponent that makes you win, that gives you the gold, that makes you the national champion.
What I'm hearing is part of what's missing for the future generations is a combative context where the drills, where the
Yes.
system can still have a life.
Yes,
Without that, it's gonna die.
yes. But the combative system is simply a way to gain the medal. It's simply a way of being able to strike ahead. The attitude of being combative is part of the formula necessary to be able to put in your sword before the other guy is able to parry or is able to avoid. So combativeness is a part of the formula. Efficiency is. Okay, it's like this. In a real fight, you're looking at the target, at the most vulnerable target, and this involves measure and angle to you. You don't go for the head if it's too far away. Now, if he pushes with his head and offers his head, and there is no danger from his sword, which is held in his hand, then you take the head. Okay. But a drill does not give you that choice.
It's a preset,
It's preset.
cookie cutter.
Yes, and especially the Cuatro Cantos was a drill that was formed by Tony in imitation of the de fondo of Hiron. not knowing that it was already present in Ilustrisimo. Because he had spent so much time developing movements that he had forgotten the original. And this is the reason that on those years, 2002, 2002, 2003, 04, and 05, 5 years running, I remember, we would be driving all the way to Binondo in order to spend time showing the drills and me explaining when do you strike which and with what.
What I'm hearing is what you don't modify are the movements in the fight strategy.
The basic movements, the foundational movements have evolved over a long period of time in which these were tested in battle. The movements that did not work in battle were not copied. They died a natural death along with the user. The movements which succeeded in keeping the user alive, which meant he was able to kill or maim his opponent, were retained. So it is a question of refining and not developing. Because if you claim to develop a whole approach, then it must be tested. And it must be tested with the most stringent conditions, which is a life and death event. This is why I once mentioned that Ilustrisimo is a dead system. There is no way that you can change because the most efficient approaches have already been found out, tested, and there is no need to evolve. Or maybe if you think you are evolving, then you are just discovering other movements which you had not practiced.
So what's the danger, or how's that going to take away from what you're committed to? People modifying and creating new ways of teaching and new techniques.
New ways of teaching, I am not against. We are discovering many factors about the human anatomy, the human brain, how we learn, and how we retain information. This will always continue to be useful. Okay, this innovation about teaching and learning. It is changing the curriculum, a proven curriculum. Okay. It is not like learning how to do surgery, because every year new facts about anatomy are discovered and you adapt your surgical techniques to these discoveries of the human anatomy. Here, unless it is that earth-shaking that you have developed or found out a way to be able to gain a split-second gain over your opponent in terms of perception, then you might want to adapt that. And it is nothing but an improvement on the old. Yes.
So would having a different teaching and training methodology than you, among Romy, go against the preservation of the archive system? So first off, I'll just ask you yes or no, and then please comment on that. And it might be yes or no, and then you could explain when is it yes, when is it no.
Okay, it's both yes and no. Why? Because unless new approaches to efficiency are discovered, there is no sense in changing what you have already. Okay. Now, if like the example of surgery, a new discovery of the anatomy changes the approach of the surgery, then yes, change. But so far, do you have 80 years of the Reconquista, 330 years of the Spaniards here using their sword work, with which to gain a new insight into be a survivor in a real sword fight?
Just so I understand this, basically it's the techniques that need to be preserved in the fighting strategy, and what's missing is also more sparring or simulated sparring that allows us to replicate the pressure that other techniques.
Yes.
I think what's going to happen is, for those of us who teach students, they're learning to do some of the concepts, but they're not fighting like Tatang. But then hopefully we'll all have students who aspire to really embody the archive system. Man, it's a really tough challenge you've given us.
Well, Tatang was a tough challenge. See? Why? Because he was a consistent winner in life and death situations. And his approach, I keep on hearing strategy. Strategy is the spur of the movements.
I think strategy is not a good term, but it's
Yes.
the best term I have right now, because strategy implies thinking about something, planning something out. But Tatang didn't have a strategy. It was more like he had in the moment rules that he followed.
Exactly.
You know, kill them, destroy the hand, get both done now.
Yes.
Smother them.
Yes. The plan was no plan.
It was consistent enough that there was a uniformity of fighting intention. Maybe fighting intention is the best word to use, I don't know.
Winning intention.
That's more accurate.
Yes.
He wasn't, Tatang wasn't there to win, he was there, he wasn't there to fight, he was there to win.
Yes. To vanquish. You know, there's a favorite statement of one of my sons. And he said, when he got angry with someone, he said, I will rise and austerize.
Okay.
Babangon ako at dudurugin kita.
Wow.
And that is exactly what Tatang had in mind.
Paki-translate.
I will rise and crush you.
Yeah.
Because he rose. That's why his stance is so high.
But I was always thinking, it's like, Dudurugan is more like, it's not just, I don't think that translates to Americans as just grind. It's really like grind at the level of totally smashed, but
Yes.
also like mixed together like a blender.
Yes.
Like you've been blended.
That's why he used.
Osterized.
That's why he used the word austerize.
Yeah.